The Bac-Lé ambush was a clash during the Tonkin Campaign in June 1884 between Chinese troops of the Guangxi Army and a French column sent to occupy Langsun and other towns near the Chinese border. The French claimed that their troops had been ambushed by the Chinese. The incident led to the Sino-French War. Background: in late 1883, France and China began to fight an undeclared war in Tonkin. In December 1883, in the Sun Tay Campaign, the French defeated the Black Flag Army and captured the town of Sun Tay. In March 1884, in the Vietnamese Campaign, they defeated China's Guangxi Army and captured the strategically important town of Bac-Lé on the Mandarin Road. The defeat at Bac-Lé, coming close on the heels of the fall of Sun Tay, strengthened the hand of the moderate element in the Chinese government and temporarily discredited the extremist, purist party led by Zhang Zhidong, which was agitating for a full-scale war against France. Further French successes in the spring of 1884, including the capture of Hung Hoa and Tai Nguyen, convinced the Empress Dowager Cixi that China should come to terms, and an accord was reached between France and China in May. The negotiations took place in Tianjin. Li Hongzhang, the leader of the Chinese moderates, represented China, and Captain François-Ernest Fournier, commander of the French cruiser Volta, represented France. The Shanxi Accord, concluded on the 11th of May 1884, provided for a Chinese troop withdrawal from Tonkin in return for a comprehensive treaty that would settle details of trade and commerce between France and China and provide for the demarcation of its disputed border with Vietnam. Fournier was not a professional diplomat, and the Shanxi Accord contained several loose ends. Crucially, it failed to explicitly state a deadline for the Chinese troop withdrawal from Tonkin. The French asserted that the troop withdrawal was to take place immediately, while the Chinese argued that the withdrawal was contingent upon the conclusion of the comprehensive treaty. In fact, the Chinese stance was an ex post facto rationalization, designed to justify their unwillingness or inability to put the terms of the accord into effect. The accord was extremely unpopular in China, and provoked an immediate backlash. The war party called for Li Hongzhang's impeachment, and his political opponents intrigued to have orders sent to the Chinese troops in Tonkin to hold their positions. Li Hongzhang hinted to the French that there might be difficulties in enforcing the accord, but nothing specific was said. The French assumed that the Chinese troops would leave Tonkin as agreed, and made preparations for occupying Langsun and other cities up to the Chinese border. The approach march. In early June 1884, a French column under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Alphonse Duguesne advanced to occupy the border towns of Langsun, Caobang and Khe. Duguesne's column consisted of a battalion of marine infantry, an artillery battery, a newly recruited company of Tonkinese riflemen, and a small force of chasseurs d'Afrique. Régacés Marceau and were veteran soldiers, who had served under the command of Commandant Henry Rivière at the capture of Nam Dinh. But the Tonkinese riflemen had only been recruited several days earlier, and were of negligible military value. The column needed to take food and rations for 45 days, and the combatants were accompanied by 1,000 Vietnamese porters, 240 French mule drivers and 200 mules. As the French were advancing through unknown country, Captain Jean-François Alphonse Lecomte of the Topographical Service rode with the column to map the route. Lecomte, who served with distinction on General Louis Brière de Lisle's staff throughout the Sino-French War, would later write a detailed account of the ambush, Le guet-apens de Bac-Lé acute. The column formed at Phu Lang Tong, the most advanced French post on the Mandarin Road, on the 11th of June. It set off for Langsun on the 12th of June, reaching Phu Xuyen on the 13th of June, Kep on the 14th of June and Cao Sun on the 15th of June. The march, under a sweltering summer sun, was grueling, and on the 15th of June Dugena sent Geordie's battery back to Phulang. At the same time he was reinforced by a company of Zephyrs from Chef de Bataillon Servier's 2nd African Light Infantry Battalion. Recent heavy rain had swollen the Song Tong River, and the French were unable to use the ford at Cao Sun. The column therefore remained at Cao Sun for 3 days while its engineers bridged the Song Tong, and only resumed its march on the 19th of June. For the next 3 days the column pressed on to the northeast, marching parallel to the course of the Tong River and camping in the open country between Cao Sun and the small town of Bac-Lé. The French now became aware that their march was being observed. Single shots were heard in the distance at regular intervals, and on one occasion French cavalry scouts came under fire. It was not clear whether the attackers were Vietnamese bandits or Chinese soldiers. On the morning of the 22nd of June the French column reached Bac-Lé. Continuing their march in the afternoon, the French descended once more into the Song Tong Valley and rejoined the river. Dugen's intention was to cross the Song Tong and continue up the Mandarin Road to Than Muyen Lang Son. The river was still swollen, and on the evening of the 22nd of June Dugena scouted its southern bank for a suitable ford. Chinese soldiers were visible on the other side of the river, and Le Perron's troopers covered them with their carbines while a French NCO tested the depth of the river. Neither side opened fire, believing that he was dealing with stragglers from the Guangxi Army who would not oppose his passage. Dugena gave orders for a crossing of the Song Tong the following morning. In fact, Dugena was facing a force of 3,100 regular Chinese soldiers of the Guangxi Army under the command of Wan Zhongshan. This force consisted of 8 battalions under the command of Huang Yuzhan and 1 battalion under the command of Wang Hongshun. A further 1,500 Chinese troops under the command of Pan Dingxin were camped close by. Most of the Chinese troops were armed with modern rapid-firing Remington rifles. Both commanders were aware of the provisions of the Shanxi Accord, but as a result of the political intrigues aimed at Li Hongzhang they had received no instructions to withdraw from Tonkin. They had instead been ordered by the commander of the Guangxi Army, Wang Dibang, to hold their positions. Wang Dibang had experience serving with General Zhao Zongtang. The ambush. At dawn on the 23rd of June Captain Lecomte crossed the Song Tong with the column's advance guard. The crossing was observed by a force of Chinese infantry deployed in a defensive position on a wooded hill 250 meters behind the river. The Chinese allowed the French troops to cross unmolested, but opened fire while the Tonkinese riflemen were crossing. Their shots were high, and it is possible that they were intended to warn rather than to kill. Lecomte reacted immediately to this hostile demonstration, deploying his infantry to flank the Chinese out of their position. The French drove the Chinese from the hill, and Lecomte established a defensive position to shelter the crossing of the rest of the column. By 11 a.m., the entire French column had crossed the Song Tong. By then an interesting situation had developed at the French advance posts. At 9 a.m., 3 Chinese envoys came forward with a written message for Dugena from the Chinese commanders. Lecomte let them through, and an interview took place. Although Dugen's Vietnamese interpreters were unable to grasp some of the subtleties in the Chinese message, they were able to establish that the French were facing regular troops of the Guangxi Army and that the Chinese commanders were aware of their obligations under the Shanxi Accord. The Chinese generals explained that they had received no orders to withdraw, and were consequently obliged to remain in the positions until further notice. They requested Dugena to send a heliograph message back to Hanoi to seek instructions. In view of the diplomatic significance of the confrontation, Dugena should have reported the presence of the Chinese force to Hanoi and asked for further instructions. Instead, he informed the Chinese at 3 p.m. that he would continue his march up the Mandarin Road in 1 hour's time. According to Captain Lecomte, Dugena believed that the Chinese would let him pass, and his intention was merely to get to his column away from the swollen Song Tong River and to find a secure camping ground for the night. At 4 p.m., Dugena resumed his advance. Aware of the potential for a misunderstanding, he gave strict instructions that nobody was to open fire except on his order. For several minutes the French column marched unmolested along a jungle path towards a group of Chinese forts on the cliffs of Nui Dong Nai. Seeing the path opening into a clearing, Dugena ordered Le Perron's cavalry to replace an inexperienced section of Tonkinese riflemen at the front of the column. As the French cavalry spurred their horses forward to move to the front of the column, Chinese infantry in the Nui Dong Nai forts suddenly opened fire on them. Seconds later, Chinese infantry shadowing the march of the French column opened fire on both its flanks. It is not clear whether the Chinese were alarmed by the sudden movement of the French cavalry or they mistook the horsemen for a party of senior officers and deliberately fired on this tempting target. The marine infantry of the French vanguard deployed as best they could and replied to the Chinese fire. Dugena, who was leading the column's main body, ordered a bugler to sound for a ceasefire, but the bugle call had no effect. The Chinese were sounding their own trumpets to bring more of their own men into action, and as it became clear that the battle could not be stopped, Dugena planned his defense. He formed his men into a square, enclosing his vulnerable baggage train, and ordered them to dig trenches. During the late afternoon of the 23rd of March, the French successfully repelled repeated Chinese attacks, and were even able to counterattack with some effect. However, the Chinese brought up fresh troops during the night, and occupied positions on the heights of Nui Dong Nai from which they could fire down on the French square. On the morning of June 24, the Chinese worked their way around the sides of the French square in an attempt to cut the column's line of retreat to the Song Tong. Dugena made several local counterattacks to take some air around his positions, but it soon became obvious that, with no artillery support, the French would be encircled and annihilated if they remained where they were. At 11 a.m., Dugena issued orders for a withdrawal to the Song Tong. Although the column suffered heavy casualties from rifle fire during the withdrawal and was forced to abandon its baggage train, Dugena successfully fought his way out of the threatened encirclement and extricated his small force. Captain Le Perron, the commander of Dugena's small cavalry contingent, dismounted his troopers so that wounded men could be loaded onto the cavalry horses. The successful evacuation of the wounded was due in no small measure to the coolness with which Le Perron and his chasseurs d'Afrique covered the retreat. Falling back by echelons, the French recrossed the Song Tong under fire and regrouped on its southern bank. In the afternoon of the 24th of June, the column retreated to Bac-Lé, followed at a respectful distance by the victorious Chinese, and occupied a defensive position on a high plateau. The relief expedition. Dugena had heliographed news of the battle back to Hanoi during the night of the 23rd of June, and General Millet, the French commander-in-chief, immediately dispatched General François de Négrier and Lieutenant Colonel Letelier to Dugena's assistance with a substantial relief column, assembled from the garrisons of Hanoi and Bac-Lé. He also ordered the 2nd Brigade of the Tonkin Expeditionary Corps to concentrate at Phu Lang Tong. De Négrier left Hanoi on the 24th of June with 2 Turco battalions, 2 companies of the 143rd Line Battalion and 2 80mm artillery batteries, traveling upriver aboard a flotilla of steamboats to Phu Lang Tong and thereafter marching light. De Négrier's relief column reached Cao Sun on the evening of the 25th of June. De Négrier joined Dugena's column near Bac-Lé on the morning of the 27th of June and made preparations for an immediate counterattack to throw the Chinese back across the Song Tong. The French scouted the Chinese positions during the afternoon, and de Négrier issued orders for an attack the following morning. However, on the evening of the 27th of June he received a heliograph message from Millet, ordering him to return to Hanoi at once. The French Premier Jules Ferry had decided to lodge a diplomatic protest and demand an explanation from the Chinese government. De Négrier complied with this unwelcome order. During the night of the 28th of June, under cover of a heavy thunderstorm, he and Duguesne withdrew their respective commands from the Bac-Lé plateau unnoticed by the Chinese. On the afternoon of the 29th of June the French reached Cau-Sun, where the wounded from the Bac-Lé battle were evacuated back to Phulang-Tong by junk. At Phulang-Tong the wounded were transferred to the gunboat Éclair, which ferried them rapidly back to Hanoi. In early July the exhausted men of Duguesne's column returned to Hanoi. De Négrier remained at Phulang-Tong with the 2nd Brigade, pressing Millet in vain for orders to attack the Chinese. Casualties. French casualties in the Bac-Lé ambush were 22 dead and 70 wounded. Chinese casualties were markedly higher, approximately 300 dead and wounded in total. Millet's order of the day. On July 1, 1884, General Millet issued the following order of the day to the men of Duguesne's column. Significantly, he blamed the engagement near Bac-Lé on the bad faith of the Chinese and described it as an ambush. Henceforth, the battle became, in French eyes, the Bac-Lé ambush. Partisan petit nombre pour occuper, conformément aux ordres du gouvernement et suivant les conventions de Tientsin, les places frontières du Tonkin et de la Chine. Vous avez écouté cette attaque dans les gorges de l'Anson par un ennemi déloyal qui s'était préparé pour vous attaquer dans un guet-apens. Mais grâce à votre énergie, vous avez déjoué toutes ces ruses. Vous avez combattu avec succès une contradiction, vous avez fait respecter le drapeau et l'honneur de nos armes. Quelques bagages abandonnés par les coolies sont restés sous pouvoir de leur ennemi. Je le proclame bien haut. Vous valez les soldats de la Première République. Si vous n'avez pas vaincu, vous avez rassuré la France par votre courage, votre constance et votre héroïsme. Honneur à vous, soldats. La République vous remercie et inscrire un glorieux fait d'armes dans ses annales. Significance. When news of the Bac-Lé ambush reached Paris, there was fury at what was perceived as blatant Chinese treachery. Ferry's government demanded an apology, an indemnity, and the immediate implementation of the terms of the Shanxi Accord. The Chinese government agreed to negotiate but refused to apologize or pay an indemnity. The mood in France was against compromise, and although negotiations continued throughout July, Admiral Ame Acute Corbett was ordered to take his Far East squadron to Fuzhou. The negotiations broke down in mid-August, and on the 23rd of August 1884, at the Battle of Fuzhou, Corbett annihilated China's Fujian fleet, inaugurating the 9-month Sino-French War. The defeat of the French forces also resulted in the unsuccessful French attempt to attack and take Taiwan, where the Chinese Hui Army under Lu Mingxuan defeated the French at the Tonkin Campaign and Battle of Tamasui.